Welcome to our multi-stakeholder dialogue on developing a sustainable financing plan for marine protected areas in Sri Lanka. We are excited to have all of you all here, and we have lots to share from CSF. As many of you already know, CSF, in collaboration with BRT, has been working on developing a financing plan for marine protected areas across the country, and we have begun with focusing on the Vidutaltiva Nature Reserve. As many of you also know, this comes at a crucial time in our development history in Sri Lanka, because as the economic crisis has progressed and the economic climate is such that it's posed significant threats to the existence of our protected areas. There has been significant pressure on public funds, which is most often than not the sole source of funding for most protected areas across the island. While many sites have been operational, Sri Lanka has risked long-term ecological benefits to pursue short-term economic relief. And we have seen this most recently as the threat of aquaculture and other development schemes have taken root in conservation sites across the country. It is within this context that we recognize that Sri Lanka is at the precipice of both distinct opportunity and immense possibility of ecological and economic loss. We have also recognized that sites could stand to benefit from unlocking innovative and long-term sources of finance. That being said, financial instruments and mechanisms are a source of fear among a lot of the environmental community and local communities on the ground. And there are distinct fears around the loss of nature sovereignty and the impacts of mechanisms would have on indigenous use. Many top-down approaches of conservation investment fail to empower local communities in financing initiatives. And there are concerns about commodification of nature and the prioritization of economic benefits. It is within this context that CSF has been working on crafting our financial plan in collaboration with Blue Resources Trust for developing a financing plan for the Vidutaltiva Nature Reserve. Through this initiative, we have examined some of the processes and requirements needed to attract financing solutions for long-term sustainability. These include analysis of stakeholders of an MPA and the users' intentions. We have commenced working with the Department of Wildlife Conservation by building their knowledge and technical capacity around conservation finance techniques, planning methodologies, and stakeholder considerations. Now, as many of you know and have been a part of this project, we have hosted a series of knowledge roundtables over the course of the past few months. And this has been part of our two-stage project or two-component project. The first is one of a collaborative learning process, which we refer to as the knowledge roundtables. It is through this process that we aim to enhance our collective understanding on marine financing, on the approaches available and the instruments that we possibly need to move forward. Each of you here today have been selected precisely for the effort and the work that you diligently do in this space. And we believe that your seat at the table has contributed significantly to the progress in this field. And that is why we have invited you here today. As we move forward with the second part of our project, which is component 2, which is developing this financing plan, we would like to hear from you, and we would also like to share some of the work, the progress, the lessons learned, the insights and initiatives that we have attempted to tackle over the last few months. My colleagues Heshal and Natasha will be taking you through this process. Heshal will be addressing some of the methodologies, the approaches, and the insights that we have learned. And Natasha will be taking us through some of the analysis that we have gained from observing stakeholders in the region. Again, like I said, users, tensions, challenges, and we would like to hear from you at the end of the day. So thank you for coming, and we hope this could be an insightful session for you all.
A very good morning, everyone. Just to start off, before we go into the work CSF has done, according to what Tashish said, just a brief introduction to the Vidutaltiva Nature Reserve. Many of you all have worked on the VNR, have worked with stakeholders in the VNR, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but just for people who might find or who are not that much familiar with the Vititaltiv Nature Reserve, just a brief overview of how it looks. So Vititaltiv Nature Reserve was declared as a nature reserve in 2016 under the Flora and Fauna Protection Act, and 29,180 hectares were declared, and it's under the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and there are 2 officers in Mannar that works on the conservation of the VNR. One is the Mannar Range Office, also the Wankale Range Office, and the other is the Vititaltiv Bittu Office, which is in the village of Vititaltiv. And if you just wanted y'all to familiarize y'all with the map of the VNR. So the VNR sits adjoining both the Mannar Island as well as the big island of Sri Lanka. So at the lower corner, you get the Wankale along with the Mannar Causeway, and it goes all the way to Erukalampidi, and then all the way up to Vellankulam, where you get passing the village of Vititaltiv. This is on your right is actually the Mannar Jaffna Highway. So it borders the Mannar Jaffna Highway on one end, it borders the Mannar Thalaimannar Road, down the Thalaimannar Road from Mannar town, and Wankale as well. So there are many livelihoods around this area. This area is historically significant, war affected for 30 years. There is displacement. You see displacement in Erukalampidi. Erukalampidi is a predominantly Muslim community that was displaced in 1990 due to the eviction of Muslims by the LTTE, and who returned back to the island in the late 1990s and the 2000s, and even as early as 2012 to 2015. And we get multiple important areas. We have the Maldivia coral reef right over the Vititaltiv shoreline, and we also have places of tension like Papamodei, Pallimunei, and so on. So just to familiarize y'all with the map, just to understand how Vititaltiv Nature Reserve sits in Mannar. Before going into Heshal, I just wanted to show you this to say that it's important to understand these boundaries. Boundaries, even though VNR is a marine protected areas, there is landmass that we need to consider. There is communities around these boundaries, communities within these boundaries that we need to consider. And specifically understanding these practicalities of conservation is important for conservation financing. And I will now hand over to Heshal before I go into my stakeholder analysis and mapping later to talk about what we've done on that regard so far.
So having looked at the VNR in its complexities, alluding to what Tashi said at the start of the presentation also, given the current context, let's now take a look at what exactly our work was and what that involvement looks like towards the goal of sustainable finance planning for protected areas. So in terms of the presentation, I'll be taking you through the background and methodology first that we applied. Then we'll take a reflection of our findings in terms of stakeholder mapping and analysis that Natasha will present. And then switching back on to what exactly CSF's tying the project together looks like in terms of approach and also in terms of reflections, and moving on to what the culmination of all our efforts have been. We will also present briefly our outputs. So moving on, let's take a quick look at what the background and the methodology to our process was. So first of all, we'd like to acknowledge that in doing this project, we wanted to focus on the importance of site level work and understanding the site level complexities to really ground the reality of what site level protected area operations look like to inform practical solutions. So this is essentially what you will see throughout our presentation as we really take you through the approach. Because what we wanted to do was understand, in terms of protected area conservation mandate holders, what their current work and approach is, as well as how does finance for biodiversity conservation in this context really fit in to what is currently being done. And then what we hope from our work is that the site level insights that we have gained will be able to better position us in terms of looking at solutions both on a site level as well as taking a step back and looking at a more holistic macro level. So I'd just like to flag at this point that in terms of our approach, we specifically wanted to focus on protected area management, and we looked at the relevant mandate holder in that situation. But given that this is a multidisciplinary roundtable session, I would encourage you to also understand that these approaches can be tweaked for different contexts based on the conservation mandate that certain parties have. So what do I mean by this? For example, if you are a private sector company and if you have a certain land that you want to focus on conservation practices, a similar approach can be followed to make to ensure that those conservation outcomes are still met. And so moving on, just to take you through the rationale of the project and what our objective truly was. So as I mentioned, to understand the context and the practicalities of conservation financing within MPAs, and what we wanted to do was demonstrate a foundation for sustainable and inclusive financial planning for marine protected areas. So this essentially funnels into, or funnels down to rather, our core goal of developing sustainable finance plans for marine protected areas in Sri Lanka. So taking a look at the background that I mentioned, what exactly is the context that we operate in, specifically to the VNR. So the VNR, as Natasha also mentioned, and Tashi also alluded to, is a protected area where the mandate holder for conservation in this situation is the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the DWC, and they have developed a 5-year management plan in this regard, and they are actually in the process of developing more. So this was completed in the start of this year based on certain practices that they have followed in the previous year alone. So what does exactly the management plan look at? It has identified threats as well as planned activities around the budget. So just to explain what the context differentiation was from not having a management plan to now actually developing a management plan. Previously, the activities of a protected area site were conducted based on the practices that site level officers were familiar with and were and in accordance to the FFPO. So this mainly looked along the lines of patrolling, along the lines of legal litigation when there is encroachment of protected area spaces, as well as some regard to things like wildlife conservation when certain animals or wildlife are threatened. What the management plan in this situation introduced newly in a more laid down approach, because this was actually included in a management plan that wasn't previously there, was things along the lines of invasive species management, things along the lines of water quality management. And Natasha will really explain this in depth further, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of what is newly included in the management plan and what we wanted to focus on. So what we see is that it has actually identified threats and planned these activities with a budget of approximately 152 million for this 5-year period that has been stipulated. So previously, on an annual basis, the average spend that we have understood to be is roughly around the lines of 3.6 to 3.8 million. So there is almost a 10 times expansion of the previously carried out activities based on the management plan budget that the DWC has currently done. And again, why is this relevant for us? Why is this important for us? Because we see this as a starting point, as a firm starting point for developing a finance strategy for marine protected areas in Sri Lanka. So this is exactly why we chose this site in question. And we saw this as an opportunity to really integrate with the mandate holder for conservation in this situation and continue work going forward. So moving on. As mentioned earlier, we spoke about our ultimate goal being setting financial strategies. So very quickly, financial strategies in a nutshell looks at a step-by-step process to A, look at financial needs, and B, look at potential revenue sources. But what does this look like for the VNR in question? So what we initially envisaged was to give a clear picture of the financial status and the requirement that needs to be met around the management plan's objective. So I think it's important that I flag that we essentially wanted to support the VNR management plan and budget because it outlines already, as I mentioned, activities around the lines of what the mandate holder for protected areas wants to continue into the future, at least for the 5-year period. What the management plan would also, what the financial plan that supports this management plan would also focus on would technically look at communicating and justifying what these conservation finance objectives and needs are for the stakeholders to encourage further involvement in terms of attracting funds and donations. So this is essentially what we saw was a bridging between what the mandate holder, the DWC, wants to do, as well as attracting or potentially being able to source available funds that would be present out externally, outside. So how did we go about this? We went about this by looking at existing best practices and methodologies through case studies that have happened before. So we focused on two in particular, the Hatamanthi Wildlife Sanctuary CIP in Myanmar, as well as a sustainable financing strategy for Cat-TN in Vietnam. So both of these case studies were examples that we chose, or case studies that we focused on for a number of reasons. Firstly, because in both the situations, it was conducted in Asia, in an area that is somewhat relevant to financing in a context that's relevant to Sri Lanka as well. But also because as documents, these documents stood out to us for two specific reasons. Because A, it was practical in its approach, and B, because it was to a large extent inclusive of the ground level practicalities as well as the stakeholders around protected area management and conservation outcomes. So what this means in terms of practicality also brings us back to what we set out to do. We wanted to create a situation where our work is able to be closely integrated to the ground situation for the Department of Wildlife to also take and run with. So this looks at developing muscles for conservation finance concepts that can actually be put forward in action. And this, what we also realized, is ultimately creates a situation where it is more likely to be used in future protected area management planning. So alluding back to what I said about the VNR management plan being the first management plan that has been done in Sri Lanka by the mandate holder, we would like to recognize that plans have been done in the past by other external parties as well. However, there have often been the instances where this plan, which is developed externally, is not necessarily integrated into the mandate holders' management systems due to various reasons, which is why we made an effort to really understand how this can be changed by focusing purely on the practical effects, which is why we looked at our two case studies in Myanmar and Vietnam specifically for that reason. Moving on, and this is something that Natasha will also elaborate more in her presentation on inclusivity. So essentially, a management plan and the subsequent financing plan around it would stand to benefit, and this is something that would be more clear as the presentation continues, from the involvement of all stakeholders. So considering stakeholders and their relationship to the VNR was of crucial importance to us. For this, we conducted a stakeholder mapping and analysis, which really looks at how the interactions of these stakeholders and the nuances of these stakeholders guide essentially any financing strategy or plan for a protected area. So that is essentially the story behind our approach, and I will take you through the approach in time to come. But now let me just hand over to Natasha to give you an understanding of what this stakeholder assessment really looked like.
Thank you, Heshal. I hope you can hear me. Yeah? Okay. So how did we go about with it? And as Heshal said, one of our first things that we did was look into stakeholders and analyzing various components of this. So we looked at users, again, we looked at conflicts, we looked at livelihoods, we looked at conservation entities, we looked at the DWC, we looked at DFAR, and also state administration. When it comes to state administration, VNR falls under 2 DS divisions, that's Manthe West and Mannar Town, 28 GN divisions or Glama divisions in total. So we looked at all these components when it came to stakeholders. Because what we understood is for financing, things like boundaries, knowing where the VNR is very key. And unfortunately, we met with communities beyond Vidithalativ like Tevan Piddi, Erukalam Piddi, who actually didn't know that a VNR exists because they kind of like, oh, is there something like that? So it's important that stakeholders who have been part and parcel of these landmass for generations know what's happening, know what is there, know the conditions, know regulations. With the absence of that, any conservation efforts will not be successful. So one of our stakeholder methodologies was developing this onion, which includes 2 categories of information. One is stakeholders that affect the Vidithalativ nature reserve, and we looked at direct and indirect. Then how the existence of the VNR or the declaration of the VNR have affected stakeholders. Again, it was declared in 2016, so not very long ago. Hence, there is an effect that the VNR, its regulations make on stakeholders as well. So that was another thing that we looked at. So when it comes to directly affected by the VNR, we have both negative effects on the VNR and positive effects. If we go to the DWC, the DFAR, who has a conservation and management role to play with regard, has a positive effect on the VNR. But when it comes to fishermen that use illegal modes of fishing, dynamite fishing around the Maldives coral reef and around in the waters in general, and fishermen that use illegal nets, and as well as in this context, the urban council who manages a garbage dumping site, which is currently halted due to the court case that was filed by AFL, and they were negatively affecting the VNR. And indirectly, we also recognize NACDA as one of the stakeholders, because NACDA had been providing some permits for aquaculture farms within land masses in the VNR post declaration. This is post 2016. So we identified that as well, and in general stakeholders that have or do go against general regulations of the FFPO. And then we have stakeholders that are affected by the declaration of the VNR. And it's important to understand this because this is land masses that existed, these are histories that existed, communities, livelihoods, income generation that have been existing for generations and generations. One is cattle and goat herders and breeders. VNR was and is yet a breeding ground. It's a landmass that herders and have been using for generations. And if you go to areas like Erukalam, you have women who engage as herders who are now obstructed from entering land, who now say, even if we go in, even if we can't go in and we send our cattle in, because we can yet send our cattle and goats in, if they get into, if there is harm, if they get sick, if they get lost, we are gonna lose income on our side. So it's our responsibility to take care of them, which we can't do anymore because we are not allowed to go in. But then when you go to the Manthai West area, along the Mana-Jaffna highway, you get areas like Papamode. If you go at around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the evening, you get cattle in the numbers of the thousands just crossing the Mana-Jaffna highway from the VNR back to the opposite side, which is actually a forest land at the moment, where herders are like, these lands, we've been herding our cattle in these lands for generations, and now we have issues, and we have been asking for pasture land, for grazing land for ages, and we are not being given grazing land. There is no gazetting for that, and now we are obstructed from going in. When there is droughts, there is the threat of cattle eating mangroves, which is recognized as a threat by the DWC as well, and they've used different methods trying to stop this, but it has not been very successful. So issues like that. And then we have private landowners within the VNR. In areas in the north of the VNR, as well as Erukalam PD, Thevan PD, we get a lot of farming land where people do have deeds and permits to these lands, but because of haphazard gazetting demarcation that was done back in 2016, where they relied on Google Maps and Google imagery, these private lands were also declared. So there is that issue as well. And then directly affected due to foregoing economic activities due to the regulations, we see seagrass farm owners, sea cucumber farm owners also having directly affected due to the declarations. And indirectly, interestingly, we've understood farmers and fishermen inside, or we put them under indirectly, because the FFPO does allow indigenous or historical paddy cultivation, farming to happen. But when we met many farmers, what they said was that they are in fear of restrictions coming in the future. Hence, we've identified as indirectly. We do have tourism operators as well who are indirectly affected, especially in Vidithaltiv. There were fishermen who, when it was low season, would take tourists to see the mangroves, see the coral reef, who no longer can do that, and so on. And also we have a few coconut farms in Erukalampidi, so toddy tappers who can't enter lands due to the declaration. Next, please. So when it comes to conservation threats, as Heshal said, in the DWC management plan for VNR, they've also recognized multiple threats, and we've categorized these threats and we've given snapshots of this for you all. The first one is fisheries related. You have mangrove cutting for fisheries where they use specifically dynamite fishing. Fishermen use mangroves, barks of mangroves for fishing. Then illegal methods, as I said earlier. Then when it comes to land rights related threats, one is the existence of private owned land, commercial activity. A big threat that the communities really pushed in and said, this is the biggest environmental threat we see, was the release of pollutants by the shrimp farms. So there's 2 shrimp farms that the community said is very important to look at, but one of it, which is the Taprobane farm down the Jaffna Manor Highway, right next to the VNR boundary in the buffer zone, is the biggest identified threat due to their release of effluents, and the communities have been saying this again and again, and we also saw the DWC also emphasizing this. And then we get natural threats like invasive species and flooding, and also droughts. There has been severe months of droughts in the recent times, which are also becoming an issue, because droughts actually indirectly lead to another problem, which is cattle herders, because what they said was during drought time, majority of the other lands that they can go into, they can't. So they have to say, this is, mangroves are the only thing. I know it's very problematic, but these situations do put people, communities in a dire situation where they're like, one cattle is worth 140,000. We don't want them to die. And these are majority, or some of these cows are also for live meat, so they need to maintain, and so on. So things like this. Tashi, next. So conservation activities, these are particularly activities the DWC does. So we have boundary demarcation. When it comes to boundary demarcation, we get laying boundary stones, putting buoys in around the Moldavia coral reef and things. So far, there's only been 5 kilometers of the boundary that has been demarcated through boundary stones. Hence, clearly, the issue of community unaware of the boundary. And then we have patrolling, the general patrolling that the DWC does. And something specific to note is the DWC actually uses the help of the police and the Navy for patrolling as well, because they don't have boats. And then we have surveys and tests. One survey is the coral reef survey. The other is actually the survey that to assess the presence of effluents on the waterways with regard to the shrimp farm. That's there. Okay. So now we come to, when it comes to financing terms, conservation cost. Conservation cost is not always monetary. You can't put a label, you can't put money in front of it. It will reflect itself in different ways. So we have divided conservation costs into 4. First is co-institutional cost, which is expenditure relating to maintaining institution policies and capacities. This is on DWC, the bigger entity of the Department of Wildlife Conservation. This cost is borne by. Then we come into operational cost, which is particularly expenditure that goes into running VNR as a protected area. And now with the management plan, what VNR needs to run what the activities they've said they do in the management plan. Then we have opportunity cost, which in many times do go unnoticed. Are foregone and diminished development land and resource use opportunities, different economic opportunities that stakeholders need to forego or diminished. Then again, the last cost, which is very much neglected and not go on into, even though you might mention it, people don't put a lot of attention to it, is the effort, time, resources required to comply, engage, and participate in conservation. This is beyond the DWC. Other people have their time, their resources. So when it comes to co-institutional, mainly borne by the government, and you do get non-government contributions as well, particularly within the with regard to VNR. Then operational costs, you get salaries, training for the conservation staff, to employ another range officer because there is no proper range officer in the VNR. For infrastructure and maintenance, the B2 office now is a rented space. There is no Vidithalative range office. It's under Bankale, so things like that. And then boats and things like that, as well as litigation. So there's a lot of litigation cases that the DWC does with regard to VNR, particularly illegal lodging that happens, illegal fishermen, and so on. So litigation. And so when it comes to opportunity costs, I'm really sorry, I'm not sure why this is happening, but so when it comes to opportunity costs, it's mainly loss of access to land for people like cattle herders, for toddy tappers, economic situations that they had to forego and diminish. And then we have tourist operators who have to forego that economic opportunity. Then we have administrative officers like the urban council, the DS divisions, who would see these lands as ways of income generation for the state or for their divisions, but now have to forego. And then we have, it's okay, Tashi. It's okay. Then we have transactional cost. Transactional cost, for example, I'll take from the DWC budget. So the DWC budget has a line item saying community engagement. It does not specify what. And it's a very considerably small amount. In community engagement, do that budgeting, do that cost reflect, or do you take into account the time the community spends, the resource the community spends, even the travel they take? If you are going to have, for example, mangrove planting, are you taking into account communities' travel in that sense? So things like that goes under transactional cost. So it's understanding all these multiplicities of issues, of conflicts, of users, of exchange, of transactions that needs to be considered for a financial plan, for a management plan as well, particularly with spaces like the VNR. We do have similar places all around the country where you see these multiple angles coming up. But how much of a time do we give attention to these costs that we ignore? So why we did this was to understand and point out that if you don't look at it, our efforts will not be fully successful. To talk about the rest of what CSF did, particularly in understanding the context of the practicalities of conservation finance, I would like to invite Heshal.
Thanks, Natasha. So as you all have just heard, regarding the VNR protected area, coming back to the financing strategy and developing a financing plan, we really took effort to understand the complexities involving stakeholders, the threats, and the costs in order to better structure and approach planning around it in terms of finances. However, and this was essentially what our project envisaged and focused on. However, coming back to where we started in terms of our objective being developing sustainable financing plans for Sri Lanka, two major points just to flag. Firstly, it is in fact the mandate holder, the person with the authority enacting the financing plan around it, that needs to be a key driver of this effort. So I'll go more into it in terms of the approach and how we had to realign. But secondly, in terms of understanding the practicalities, there are also certain nuances that haven't necessarily been captured in the existing structure, which we needed to revisit. To do this and to essentially understand the context to work towards developing this sustainable finance plan, what we did was we developed a four-step approach based on the methodologies that I explained earlier on. This in itself is the first time a finance strategy and a plan has been developed for Sri Lanka, working this closely with protected area mandate holders. It is important to realize and recognize that it's also the first time that the mandate holder has approached conservation with this structure. Like I mentioned before, the VNR management plan is the first management plan that the Department of Wildlife Conservation has in-house developed. So given that those two complexities, those two themes needed to be dealt with, what we realized is at the end of the day, having a document that has finance plans isn't as I would say crucial to the effort to developing finance plans as walking the mandate holder through the steps, as making DWC and other conservation mandate holders realize the importance of financing around it. And this takes me to the approach that we actually followed. We took a four-step approach where we first wanted to understand exactly what the DWC's VNR budget and processors were about. So this looks at understanding the management plan and as well as the budget development and execution strategy. So this is something that is also elaborated on in our outputs. But just to take you through the key processes of how the Department of Wildlife developed the management plan in the first place, which we said should be the foundation for a financial plan around it, started off as this. And these were insights that we gained through interviews, multiple interviews with the DWC and stakeholders in terms of the steps that they followed to ultimately developing the management plan. And this, I would like to flag, is important for perhaps the stakeholders in the room because the DWC is following similar approaches to developing plans for other protected areas. For example, in Anavilundava, for example, in Kayankani. And we feel that these processes should be looked at in this way. So what essentially the DWC did was initially going through a process of primary data collection by doing field visits from the Colombo office to the Mana regional office and the BIT2 office, working closely with the rangers to understand what exactly their activities look like, what exactly the previous budgets have looked like, and also getting information along the lines of what more is to be done. So for example, I alluded to the fact that What is newly involved in this budget looks at water quality management and invasive species management. So this was not something that was previously annually done before. There wasn't regularity in terms of these two activities. But once it is included in the management plan, based on the insights of the range officers, the actual implementers of the activities on a site level, this is to be more regularly processed in for the 5 years. So having done that, a literature review and evaluation has also been conducted based on what exactly the intricacies of the Vidataltiu Nature Reserve looks like. And based on that, activities and budget line items for the management plan have been drawn. So Natasha took you through some examples, but essentially the 152 million budget has been split into different activity categories, and more information can be found, as I mentioned, on our outputs regarding this. And then the process follows an approval where the Director General of the Department of Wildlife, who initiated the process and who plays a clear role in the committee that is responsible for structuring the management plan, approves it and gives his seal of approval, the embossed seal. And then further it is disseminated. So as at this moment, even the range officers at the VNR have a copy of this management plan, and our expectation is, or the expectation is, for this management plan to be carried out as per the stipulated activities in it. Now taking a look at how the budget was developed and executed, we understand that the management plan activities are based on past activities as well as new activities that they wanted to include. When speaking with the DWC in terms of the interview processes, we understand that how they came up with the actual line item numbers for this budget was in fact something that was done in terms of getting very rough estimates for this, because the process that the DWC wants to follow is on an annual basis. Activities included in the management plan are to be brought to the action plan that gives a guideline of what exactly their annual activities look like. So just to clarify, the activities that are already in the management plan for the VNR are to be taken on an annual basis based on reviews that the DWC officers have to an action plan, and then costed and structured accordingly. And this follows the usual process that we see in any government department in terms of following a tender strategy and getting quotas. But this is to be done at the start of the year when it is when that activity is to be followed through. It hasn't necessarily been, the tender process hasn't necessarily been followed for all the activities already in the budget, which is fine, which is the way that the DWC has envisaged their plan, where on an annual basis, it's the action plan that actually receives approval and is therefore enforceable at that point in time. So having looked at what exactly the process that they followed for developing the management plan as well as their budget, we also wanted to understand whether the DWCs understood the true cost of conservation, what we call the true budget and the processes around it. So here we wanted to work closely with the DWC to discover that true budget, because as I mentioned, it is the enforcers of these management plan activities who have the capacity, the ability to carry out the activities in terms of understanding the financing need, as well as making sure that all costs of conservation that Natasha elaborated on are to some extent considered, including opportunity costs. So what we understand this looks like is essentially, again, activities that the DWC, we are aware, has begun in terms of looking at assessments. They have started looking at metaphor assessments for certain protected areas. And they are essentially understanding or getting closer to what that protected area truly needs in terms of financing. Moving on, what this leads us to is we have a budget and we have a true budget of the VNR. The budget reflects the activities that the DWC envisages, and the true budget looks at the follows a methodology that discovers what exactly all the costs of conservations are. And this leads us to what essentially would be identified as a gap. And we wanted to empower DWC to identify this gap in terms of a budget and also in terms of processes, which I'll speak a bit more on later, and how this can be thought of as a first step to being addressed. So to do this, we had a series. We have envisaged a series of workshops. We've had one in the past, and we've closely had interviews and discussions with DWC in terms of having these workshop series to understand or to introduce these key conservation finance concepts for the DWC, who is in this situation, the mandate holder. So having looked at what the steps are and what the steps that I just explained were, we also identify that in this whole process, given that it is still early days, given that the management plan that the DWC has in-house developed is very early, there were certain challenges that we encountered in terms of closing off on these items. And let me take you through what these challenges might have looked like. So in terms of understanding the budget and the budget processes, we understand that the prescribed processes, one question that we had was, do the prescribed processes actually happen? So for example, in terms of the site level consultations, where the Colombo office who drafts the budget and the management plan gets information from the range officers, there were certain discrepancies in terms of what those items look like, what have actually been in fact included in the management plan. Also on the lines of data, we had a question of, is the data that is necessary for the management plan activities that the DWC wants to do, is it available or is it collected? So a very clear example that came up for this was in the DWC item of doing water quality assessments. There was a gap in terms of understanding what the baseline level of water quality was. And this was a challenge that needs to be addressed. Secondly, in terms of understanding the VNR's true budget and processes, the question of, were all stakeholders properly considered? So alluding to what I said in terms of what the financial plan has to be, structured of a management plan, we understand that stakeholder considerations need to be integrated and considered to some extent. So the process in which the DWC or any mandate holder would go about getting all these stakeholders' concerns addressed to the management plan, which is essentially what it sets out to do, because there are, for example, some line items that looks at conservation, which looks at community engagement, which looks at things along the lines of doing those assessments for community. Was this done prior to the development of the management plan? And lastly, in terms of understanding the budget processes and gaps, we have a question of all site level spending considered in the budget itself. So what I very clearly mean by this is there were instances in which certain external support for budgeted activities, certain external support for activities that were carried out weren't inherently considered in the budget. So for example, we have Pelagikos, who is a partner of the project overall. And similar to other external third parties to the mandate holders, there is support in terms of conservation activities that are carried out. However, a budget by the mandate holder should ideally allude to or consider these costs, because these are ultimately costs of conservation. These are ultimately costs that need to be recognized on some level. So this also we saw as a key challenge and a key question that we uh, need to address moving forward. Yeah. So what are some of the reflections that we have come to regarding our activities in this area? So firstly, we looked at the conservation mandate holder having a finance strategy that enhances the management plan itself. As I mentioned, and time again, and as Tashi also clearly elaborated on, the context of which the financial plan and the management plan being developed sets the stage for the success of any strategy. So given that we are in the early days of developing management plans and such budgets, there is an opportunity to integrate finance more and adapt it better into these structures. Therefore, we believe that the DWC would benefit from having a more structured approach for management plan, budget, and development. What this means is, in terms of, for a very small example, what I alluded to in terms of the budget being, the budget line item being finalized in the action plan at the beginning of the year, perhaps a a proper costing could be done prior when the management plan budget is being developed itself. Because this, in fact, reduces the risk in terms of having a smaller deviation from what is actually budgeted for and what the actual expense turns out to be. This also incentivizes long-term care that's taken around protected area management planning and the budget. So we need to realize that, as it's mentioned, there is a certain level of flexibility that already exists within the system, and this is a feature. This is not a bug. This is not necessarily an issue, but it needs to be carefully balanced against against having that sort of structure to ensure that the planned activities are followed. Secondly, or alluding to this point, we also understand that a comprehensive needs assessment on protected area site levels could strengthen management plan activities. And as I mentioned, there are certain steps being taken to look into assessments in terms of what exactly the needs are. So this, in fact, minimizes the risks of having the budget gap. And it is, in fact, a great starting point to consider all the costs, including opportunity costs in terms of conservation. And lastly, the DWC, just like any mandate holder who has conservation outcomes stipulated, having a clear and justifiable budget now encourages more external support and funding. And this is a point that I want to emphasize, and something that I feel the people of this roundtable are definitely more familiar with, given that our past sessions have also focused on innovative financial solutions. In order to have those financial solutions readily deployable within the Sri Lankan context, be it at the Colombo office or at a site level, it is imperative that you have these justifiable and clear structures set in place to attract external funding in this regard. And we really hope that this will ideally be addressed with mandate holders such as the Department of Wildlife and also the other mandate holders that Natasha spoke about that are specific to the VNR, being the DFAR, NACDA, where they consider all these opportunities and see this as it is, as an opportunity instead of more work or a threat moving forward. And secondly, another key reflection of our whole of the project that we have done so far involves cohesion of the VNR stakeholders. So you might have this question. We have spoken about the inclusivity, and Natasha has also clearly elaborated on why stakeholder involvement in this regard at this level is imperative for financial plans. But what benefits, or rather, how exactly this can be done? So we have seen that regular platforms for interactions that actually enhance collaborations have been started and do exist, and we would like to encourage that, because ensuring community support and participation in such conservation activities improve significantly conservation outcomes. So there have been meetings that have been initiated at the VNR through the help of the external parties such as Pelagikos, in terms of bringing the DWC range officers, the DFAR officers, as well as members from the community to regularly meet and discuss certain issues and decide on ways forward. Secondly, and this is a greater point to consider, taking a step back, focusing on the VNR effect, but also recognizing that it is relevant for other protected areas. In terms of communication and greater involvement of other authorities, we believe that the fragmented landscape of mandate holders and activities greatly impedes the ability to structure financing plans and things along the lines that support conservation. So, for example, even the VNR, who has, other than the Department of Wildlife, you have the Department of Fisheries, you have NARA, you have NACTA, who have varying degrees of interest, but have activities that overlap in terms of conservation outcomes. We believe that cohesion of these stakeholders is imperative for the success of any financial plan. And lastly, building strong relationships with such stakeholders are in effect vital for or guarantee the success of such conservation efforts. So that brings me slowly to the conclusion of our presentation today. And before Tashi wraps up, I just wanted to focus again very simply on a few summary takeaways in terms of how what we have done and how what we spoke about today, the implications of that work in terms of marine protected area financing mechanisms. So firstly, in order to accurately and systematically identify the true cost and cost bearers of conservation, we need to recognize that this goes beyond looking at protected area or conservation budgets in existence, which focuses on past activities and envisages future activities as well, as a large extent of costs of conservation costs need to be truly considered in this regard. And secondly, in terms of assessment of stakeholders and the relationships between them and the tensions between them, we need to focus on how these can be addressed, because increasingly this is becoming an area of concern for investors as well as funders of conservation outcomes and objectives. And that brings me to the close of my presentation.